Special thanks to our podcast sponsors, Brigitte and Bashar Kalai, Hallie Vanderheider, and Sippy and AJ Karana.
At Crime Stoppers of Houston, we believe in safety for all, and to achieve that, it's necessary to have balanced conversations where all are represented. Here's where we come together to do just that. Welcome to The Balanced Voice.
To date, the Innocence Project has successfully exonerated over 300 people via DNA evidence. According to University of Virginia law professor Brandon Garrett, roughly 75% of all wrongful convictions are due to faulty eyewitness testimony. While 300 cases is merely a small percentage of convictions nationwide each year, it is still 300 completely innocent people whose lives have been severely and negatively affected by our justice system getting it wrong. Those people are people like Greg Kelly and his wife Gabri, our episode 3 guest. Greg was wrongfully convicted of sexually assaulting a child and later exonerated, and as is legal in Texas, was sentenced to 25 years without parole almost exclusively due to the faulty eyewitness account of a 4-year-old child. Leading memory experts such as Dr. Elizabeth Loftus suggest that memory is not always as reliable as we think it is, especially amongst children, but that jurors are extremely swayed by eyewitness testimony. When our justice system gets it wrong, they not only steal the life of the wrongfully convicted, but also fail to find justice for the victim. As an organization who finds it incredibly important to elevate and believe the voices of the victim, it is important for us to have this conversation today about the intersection between wrongful convictions and victim advocacy. Today on The Balanced Voice, we welcome Michelle Simpson Tuegel, attorney and advocate for the legal rights of victims, and Jennifer Hohman, Balanced Voice contributor and Crime Stoppers of Houston board member, for a conversation about wrongful convictions, eyewitness testimony, victim advocacy, and trauma-informed care. Without further ado, here's your host, Renia Mancarios.
Welcome to the Balanced Voice podcast. We are thrilled to have today's episode. We are actually joined by two of our podcast contributors, two women you're going to see many times throughout the season. First is attorney Michelle Simpson Tuegel, who is coming to us from Dallas. We're going to explain a little bit more about Michelle in a minute. And also Jennifer Hohman, who you've already seen on the podcast. She's in Houston, just down the street. Guys, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you.
So we're going to start. Michelle, you are a nationally recognized attorney. You've had a key role in some of the largest settlements locally and across the country. Jen, you are an oil and gas executive, but you're also a community advocate that focuses on sexual exploitation and trafficking, a mom of 2 boys. We're going to be talking about a lot of stuff today, guys, from wrongful convictions to sexual assault to human trafficking to criminal and civil rights to the protests and so much more. So we were excited to have you both. We're going to dive right in and look at wrongful convictions. So guys, we had on the podcast not too long ago, Greg Kelly, a young boy in Leander, Texas, who was wrongfully accused of sexual assault of a 4-year-old. There was very little done in terms of investigation. He was a star football player on track to receive, he was already offered full scholarships to multiple schools in Texas to play football. Everything was taken away. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison without the option of parole. Community members got involved and actually riled up this change. He was exonerated last November. Again, you can see his full story on Showtime's Outcry, or you can watch the podcast from which he visited with us. But Michelle, I want to start with you. The topic of wrongful conviction. We are a tough on crime organization. Jen works with us quite a bit. We are absolutely tough on crime. But we absolutely cannot handle to see anybody wrongfully charged or convicted. And it's my understanding that we're living in a time and a day where a young boy, especially a young boy of color, maybe minority, the odds are stacked against them once they are accused of something. And this is an area you've worked in for quite some time.
Yeah, I have. And it's, now I represent only victims and survivors in civil cases where usually a crime has occurred and is part of the civil case. But my previous legal career was in the area of criminal defense. And for years, and I always share this with the survivors that I represent now, I represented people who were accused. And it really gave me an appreciation for, from the legal perspective, how important constitutional rights are and due process. I don't, it doesn't matter what side I'm on. I will always take that as something that can't change and that is so important to our system. But even with those constitutional rights, we sometimes get it wrong. And that is a really scary piece of our criminal justice system that I have seen. Do I think it's the majority of cases? No, I don't, especially violent crimes. But the fact that our criminal justice system is very imperfect, and I can talk more about different areas beyond just wrongful convictions where I've seen it be so flawed and impact people's lives, like this young man. But, I always tell my survivors that I represent now that we want the perpetrator to have rights because it strengthens the validity of the truth of their claims that we got it right. And that's what we hope for. And that's what we want to do. When we get it wrong, that takes away from every single survivor who has reported and told their truth, and it takes away from that. And so that we want to make sure that an accused person and even the guiltiest of perpetrators has rights and that they have process, I think protects everybody. And that's something I explain to the victims that I represent now.
These cases particularly strike a chord for moms. That's at least what we've heard. On the other hand, you've held the hand of human trafficking survivors. You've been in court where those who, by all accounts, are guilty are given deferred adjudication or told to just turn around and go sin no more almost. What are your thoughts on these types of cases, especially when you look at some of these suspects?
So Rania, at first, I'm a citizen of this world. I am a female. I have sisters that I grew up with. We were predominantly a female home, and my dad was outnumbered all the time. And so my passion for girls, which are usually the majority of who this offends, is just so strong since birth. And then I had boys, right? And then being a boy mom, you're like, oh my God, is this what my child and is faced against? But who lives with privilege because he's white. And so, so there, I have both sides of the coins. For me, I think we have to create prevention on both sides so that they, most importantly, that people like Michelle can, we have to react and get into a situation, we know how to address it from both perspectives and help both. And that not only just getting them out of trouble, but long-term mentally, the type of therapy and rehabilitation they need, but more importantly, prevention. So I teach my sons, you be above reproach all the time. When you're at a club, protect girls. Don't you dare have sex with her without consent. Right. And so I think that's from a boy perspective. I am teaching my children to understand humility and vulnerability and consider others. From the girls that I now call my daughters, who have been so brutally sexually assaulted so many times a day, it has built confidence and build how important you are and how loved you are. And so it's both sides of the coin. So to hear somebody was wrongfully terminated kills my heart for my kids. But to hear somebody that got away, I have still bullets for them. So, it's this balance of how do you do both? But really, I think a lot in prevention, Michelle, and I think that's where your advocacy for both sides in our Constitution and trying to better our criminal justice system is best. But look, the problem a question I have for you is, do we always believe the victim?
That's a really good question. And I struggle with that phrase. As a lawyer, I think the answer to that has to be that every case has to be evaluated fully, and we have to hear the facts, and I have to talk to the survivor. And that is not to say that I have one bent one way or the other. I think once survivors have reported, we have to believe it in the sense that we have to take that information and do something with it and act. Now, what does that look like is going to be very dependent on the facts and what can be corroborated. That being said, I mean, in the state of Texas and in most states, a person's word alone is enough evidence to convict someone. And people struggle with that. But sometimes in sexual abuse and assault cases, that is the only evidence that exists.
So wait, Michelle, I want to interrupt you. A person's word alone coupled with evidence that corroborates the statement, or literally the person's word alone?
The person's word alone. In Texas, we have something called the one witness rule. And that means that if a jury of 12 believes that victim to the standard of proof that's required, so if 12 people believe the testimony of that victim that I was sexually assaulted on June 4th of 2007 by John Smith at X place, and maybe there are details that are their own details that are corroborated, like where they were, their cell phone information. That doesn't even have to exist. But sometimes there are details that may corroborate their own testimony that really come from their own information. But that isn't required. If a jury of 12 believes that person's testimony beyond a reasonable doubt, it gets to that level of proof, that can be enough evidence alone to result in a conviction. And that is both a strength of our criminal justice system and a potential risk. I mean, it works both ways. And I think kind of in answering your point, Jennifer, that's where, you know, I've been a criminal defense attorney. And so I've been on that side of cross-examining people that I have questions about, or at least I have to question them and ask the hard questions about whether or not those things and those pieces make sense and match up, and whether there was a motive not to tell the truth.
But you made a good point, Michelle. What I think and this is, I'm speaking to every parent out there.
Yeah.
It has to be enough that if your child says it, just them saying it is enough for you to act that there's a potential exploitation or assault. Just if they say it. You know, I know you've had some involvement in the Nassar case, but I'm sure we'll get to that. But just if your child is saying it, it means you have to act and do. But just because they said it or somebody says it doesn't mean you have to presume guilty. Right? I think, is that the balance, Michelle?
And I think you hit it just right, because I think, and where I've seen just horrific abuse continue for years and years, is where a child, usually a female child normally, reports something and there is no action, either because an adult's reputation is more important, they're not believed. There are a number of reasons why I've seen adults don't act. They're trying to protect some institution like the church or the school or the sport. And so where I think believe survivors, to me, what that means is that when someone reports abuse, we have to act. We can't not do something. We can't not tell someone. Now, what that action will mean is going to be dependent, you know, on what happens in the process. I can't take every case. I haven't believed every case, or I've wondered and had, you know, concerns about specific facts or details. But the vast majority of the survivors who I have talked to, I do believe. Because I think I do think in the criminal defense community, and my criminal defense friends probably won't appreciate this, I think sometimes there is a little bit of a blowing up about how many wrongful convictions in sexual abuse and assault cases there really are. Can it happen? Yes. Is it the majority? No. Is it a large percentage? No. And I would have said that even when I was on the defense side, defending people who were accused. I think there is always a margin for something that is not going to hold up or be concerning in anything. But I think most women who go through that process and most children who report, I have seen it be backed up by other information, and I have believed them. So that's the reality of it. But I see where you're coming from with the statement. But I also am always very cautious too of the survivors that I represent now and how they take in that statement, because I know how hard it is. And you've sat with women who have been grilled and questioned in ways that are demeaning and difficult and, quite frankly, destructive. And so I never wanted to do that to them by even saying that we don't believe them, but we have to go through the process. And I always tell my clients that protects you as much as your perpetrator. And by giving him those rights, we are making a system that is not perfect, but is more validated. And that validates what happened to you.
You know, there's this piece, Rania, that I think you and I have talked about, which is people of color, right?
Yeah.
When a person of color is the perpetrator, guilt is presumed. When a person of color is the victim, the perpetrator is not, the perpetrator is assumed not guilty. Does that make sense?
And
so
the
if it's a black,
the assumption is the victim is not telling the truth.
That's right. So how does bias play in this, Michelle? I mean, you know, that it goes to what we're protesting now and some are rioting for, but man, that's such a, but when it's played out in the media and when you've got these biases, how the hell do you deal with that?
And I want to add to that because, Michelle, as you were sharing just a minute ago, it's not like there's an overwhelming number of those who are wrongfully convicted. But if you watch mainstream media and you look at from Justice Kavanaugh to the Me Too movement, it looks like a majority of victims are not getting justice. And on the flip side, anyone to Jennifer's point right now, that anyone of color is getting wrongfully accused if they're the perpetrator, or any victims are just getting, it's just they're not believed. So I want to tie it all together in Jennifer's question.
I mean, getting to the issue of bias and definitely race, I have seen play a huge part in our criminal justice system and how victims and perpetrators are handled. And having worked on both sides of criminal and civil cases, that is one of my biggest issues and areas that needs reform. And I don't have the answers or what the fix is, because bias is such a deeply rooted problem. And it goes beyond just, you know, taking immunity away from police or allowing the protesters to do what they're going to do, or giving more civil rights. When I think about these issues, I think to the words of one of my friends who's a civil rights attorney, and he talked about the fact that his parents, who are close to the same age as my parents, protested and fought during the civil rights era. He's a lawyer of color. And that they were given certain rights with the Civil Rights Act that they thought would change things. We put laws in place that we thought would change some things, not make it perfect. And that sort of agreement that they had with the US government in enacting some of these civil rights laws failed. And what he said we're seeing in the streets now, and this just like gave me goosebumps when he said it, was, we're having the trials we never got in the streets. And that was just such an incredible thing when he said that my own sort of privilege and understanding what civil rights really means and what people of color and how they are impacted in our criminal justice and civil system and just in daily life, of the frustration that comes with that. And I guess my big point is getting to, I don't know how to fix it, but I know that it's broke. And I know that it does impact people on both sides, Jennifer. And I've really seen it at play, probably in its most extreme and concerning form, in death penalty cases. I tried death penalty cases for years, and a lot of citizens don't know this. I think it's so interesting, and it was one of the most interesting parts of the practice of law I've ever been involved in, is something called individual jury selection. In death penalty cases, we talk to potential jurors one person at a time. And sometimes we're talking to a potential juror for a couple hours, whereas normally with the normal, you come in for jury duty, they talk to the whole panel maybe for 1 hour. We're talking to one person for a few hours. And talk about digging in and hearing some racial bias. When I'm sitting there with my Black client who is accused of murder in a predominantly white community with a predominantly white jury panel, who is accused of killing a white person. talk about some bias and some unfairness and not even knowing how we deal with those things other than talk about them.
And who think that just because they have Black friends that they're not racist or they don't have bias when they really don't truly. I find it interesting that what you said was we didn't fight those wars in the streets back when we were doing civil rights. Do you know that when we were, what we believed was freeing ourselves from enslavement, it is now repeating itself in the form of human trafficking. So you can see how we didn't address some of these foundational layer things. You're right. We fought for it back then at the surface, but to dig deep and what the solutions were is now yet playing out again in another cause or another issue.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, I think it's interesting to, we almost inherently are deciding as a society who is worth fighting for and who isn't. And the civil rights movement was our time to say we believe people of color, all people are worth fighting for. Now we've come to this part in society where young women in general, they're there to be victimized. They're there for our pleasure. And are we standing up now through the Me Too movement, through the movement of all these anti-human trafficking groups, through coalitions across the country with community members and law enforcement to say, look, no, we're not going to allow this. We're not going to allow this type of slavery. Before we get onto the topic of human trafficking, though, and sexual assault, because Michelle, you've covered some of the biggest cases across this country, literally. I want to go back to one of the things you talked about with jury selection, just to make the point. When you're dealing with a death penalty case and you have the option to sit down with a potential juror for an hour, that's a positive in terms of weeding out inherent biases and racism to ensure that the person on trial gets the fairest type of jury trial possible.
It is. I mean, it is in theory, and that is definitely how we were trying to use it as a tool to identify those biases and weed people out. I'm going to try to say this in the best way possible. The frustrating and the limiting thing about it wasn't that there weren't good people. I believe there's goodness in most people. I just still have to believe that. But it was that the bias was so wide and touched so many people, and so many people were unwilling to admit the bias, even if we kind of guided them in the words that we needed to get rid of them, which is part of the skill that we try to develop, quite frankly, is I need you to say these words if this is really how you feel, and then you're gone. A lot of people don't want to articulate those words. We know what they think. We know what they feel. I need to get rid of them. But there are so many of them, particularly, and I started doing some jury workshops with the NAACP after some of these cases, because I was like, where are the people of color? Why aren't they showing up? Why are we losing them? And I started talking to the Black community about, like, we need more of y'all to show up. Like, it is so important that you show up for jury service more than anyone. I think it's very similar with voting, because when you are the smaller voice and you are a minority, your voice matters so much that you show up and be heard. And so because there was a lower percentage of people of color, and then we had a larger percentage of white people that were older, that's kind of your demographic for a lot of jury service. It's not to say that I think every person was a racist, but I think many of those white people had biases that were deeply ingrained, that were hard to get them to admit and articulate, but I believe still impacted jury service and their ability to really look at the case in a way that didn't somehow factor in. And that is a huge flaw, and it's one reason just personally why I don't think we should have the death penalty. I don't think it's been fairly applied.
I want to switch gears to talk about sexual abuse survivors. You, Michelle, have represented, as I said, survivors in extremely high-profile cases, Larry Nassar litigation against Michigan State University, USA Gymnastics, and the U.S. Olympic Committee, sexual assault survivors at the University of Southern California, and clergy abuse survivors connected with the Pennsylvania grand jury report, and nationwide. You've done that and so much more. Mm-hmm. You've also identified some changes that needed to be made in local law, particularly Texas, and I'm not sure if other states in terms of statute of limitations and sexual abuse victims. Can you walk us through what that is? What
Sure. So, I mean, speaking specifically about Texas, the change I'd really like to see that I have seen in states across the country, there's sort of been, especially pre-COVID, a lot of states were starting to pass legislation of what I call revival windows or statute of limitation windows, that basically we know now from having studied and we have data, sadly now, on a lot of sexual abuse cases and survivors over the decades. And we know that the median or average age of reporting for most sexual abuse survivors who were abused as a child is actually in a person's 50s of when they will disclose or report the abuse. And so a lot of states, based on that data, have started opening up windows, and also in sort of separately from that, extending the statute of limitations, both for criminal cases and for civil claims that might be a civil lawsuit against an institution and or the individual abuser. And that is based on that information that we know that it's really hard to report and disclose and that people don't do it quickly. And so the piece that has happened in Texas that I really don't give myself credit, I give the survivors and the clients who I represent who lobbied and showed up and testified in the Texas Senate in 2019. But those survivors testified and said, people in Texas need more time. Children do not report quickly. And the Texas legislature in 2019 extended the statute of limitations to 30 years from age 18. Before that, it was 15. Before that, I think it was 5. Before that, it was 2. And the sad thing, and the thing that happens a lot at my office, is I get phone calls from survivors who were abused in 1990. And they would like to do something about it now in civil courts. In criminal, it's a little bit different. There have been some extensions of the statute, and the statutes were often longer. But for the civil claims, a survivor who is my age, who was abused, I'm 36, about to be 37, who was abused in 1990, their claim ran 2 years after they were 18. So when they were 20 years old, the time for them to file a civil lawsuit had run. And what a number of states, New York, New Jersey, California, even Arizona, a red state, had a window this year. They have passed a set period of time that survivors can file a lawsuit, even if it is past the statute of limitations and it's widely publicized. There's often a lot of sort of public service announcements and information that people have the ability now to file claims for this set period of time. A lot of the windows are 1 to 3 years. New York's was 1 year, and the governor just extended it another year due to COVID, and California's is 3 years. And so if you were abused in that state, you have the ability for that 1 year to file your claim. It is not retroactive for criminal cases because there are constitutional implications there. But for civil claims, people who, I have clients in New York and New Jersey I have clients in their late 70s, early 80s who call me and for the first time are disclosing that they were abused to another person.
I have to say something here.
Yeah.
First of all, I am not a Me Tooer. Probably because my father, I'm the daughter with 3 girls in my family. So my father came from a country where women were second-class citizens in the Middle East. And he always told me, just threaten to beat the out of them so you have to bleep me. Sorry. Beat them up if they touch you in the wrong place. So I was never a Me Tooer because somebody knew at 4'11", I would punch them either in the knees or somewhere where it hurt worse. However, now dealing with victims and survivors of this type of trauma, I cannot imagine living with this trauma for 50 years and then getting there and saying, I want him to pay for that or her to pay for that. And they can't. So hands down to you. And Rania knows, I don't give it to too many. Hands down to you and those survivors and advocates who legislated for this. That's amazing. But I would also tell you, do you not also believe that so that we don't create that for the future, you have gotten to 30 years, but now that our courts need to also be trauma informed. Everybody in that criminal justice system that deals with victims of sexual exploitation, sexual abuse, need to, even in the family and child courts, need to understand trauma-informed care, need to understand how to deal with those victims and even those perpetrators from a trauma perspective.
Yeah, no, totally agree. I mean, couldn't agree with that more. And when I hear trauma informed, I can't help but think of some of the examples where I have seen that not be the case with even maybe well-meaning law enforcement officials, because I always tell my clients, it's not that I'm not going to ask you the hard questions. That is my job, so I know your case. But before I do, I want to explain why I'm going to ask this hard question and what the purpose is. So I'm not just asking you, what were you wearing that night? Like, that's your fault, and that's what caused the sexual assault. We're going to talk about all of the details leading up to what happened, because I need to know, because what you were wearing doesn't play into whose fault it was, but it is a logistical thing that I need to know of how your clothing was removed or how hard it was to rip off. And I know that's a graphic thing to think through, but it's a factual thing. But when a police officer has a 20-year-old female victim, and I'm thinking of a client in a specific case who sat down and she had been sexually assaulted the night before by a stranger, not a friend. This was not acquaintance rape. Not that any is better or worse. They're all horrible. And she sat down and bravely disclosed this. And the first thing the officer asked, and I think it's an example of not being trauma informed, was, well, what were you wearing? Do you think he thought you were a prostitute? And I can tell you that woman wants no part of the criminal justice system. And I think he was trying to do his job. He was asking some of the hard questions, but in such a horrible, not trauma-informed way. There was a way that he could have done that so different. And I'm not saying that they shouldn't do their job, because I know asking the hard questions is part of the job. But what your point is, and I think is so important, is that how we do that and how we prepare the person receiving that tough question is what trauma-informed means, and that we don't know what that person has been through. But I think being trauma-informed, and I'm not like a psychological expert, but having, like you, sat with a lot of survivors, is not assuming that we know what they're feeling, and trying to anticipate and prepare them for what's coming in a way that is just kind, like you would want someone to treat your own child if they were sitting in that chair. And so I think that is a huge piece that needs to be fixed in our system and at all levels. So
I'm going to write down your name for the 2021 session when we want to introduce a trauma bill again, because it didn't pass last time. So
we're moving. I think we're moving in that direction. When you look at all the changes in terms of law enforcement and I know at least here in Harris County, there are changes that they're making to be more trauma informed, even looking at how the officers are trained, how they interface with community members, how they interface with victims. I think we're moving in that direction. What I want to do now is sort of take this conversation to the average person just listening. Where are the ways that a child can be victimized? And I always want to make this real to people listening. You know, Jennifer and I have talked about social media being sort of the new track, the new way young boys and girls can be lured into sex trafficking. Michelle, you've done a lot of work, in camps, in churches, in schools and universities. You've looked at getting into ride sharing, Uber and Lyft cars. Jen and I were talking about facilities where, residential treatment centers where maybe the staff on hand there are no background checks. Can we bring this down to the average listener? Where are the places that you may be surprised to learn that your own child could be potentially victimized and become a victim of sexual abuse in some way?
Well, I'm curious to hear Jennifer's thoughts, but I think anywhere that a child is alone with an adult is a potential concern. And that's the reality. I was an athlete, and I remember my parents being like, "You're not staying at this camp alone." And I'm certainly not telling parents no kids can go to camp, but there is a risk inherent with anywhere that an adult who is not you is alone with your child. And that's a really scary thought. And I'm not trying to make parents paranoid, but I have seen that with in sports abuse, in youth camps, in the church, which many families now we're kind of more aware of it, but many families thought was the safest place for their children, is actually sometimes the farthest from that. And so I think, you know, Jennifer, you've probably dealt with this and you spoke to it really well, but prevention is also partly talking to our kids and arming them with the ability to be open with us, to know their own bodies, and to prepare them to disclose immediately if anything, even any grooming behavior starts to happen. Because we can't, I've said this before, we are never going to get rid of all the Larry Nassers. That's a horrible nightmare of a thought. But there are always going to be more Larry Nassers and more broken people who will hurt people. I hope we can stop as many of them as possible. But what we can prevent and what we can do is take action when we hear something, which is what people didn't do with Larry Nassar and why he kept going for decades. When adults knew, they didn't act. And we can prepare young women and young boys to not feel ashamed to communicate when something strange happens, because it doesn't all usually happen in one event. Sometimes it does, but sometimes it's little things leading up to that. That's not on the child, and I'm not saying it's on the victim, but if we're really talking about how do we prevent this, I think Jennifer said it great, is on all ends. And that comes with the adults preparing children, knowing their bodies, disclosing, knowing and understanding grooming behaviors. I mean, that's a hard thing to talk about with kids, but it's a huge piece that I've seen in sexual abuse cases with adults who have access to children alone, and that ever getting to that place. I think it's in the work that Jennifer's doing of finding vulnerable populations of young women and girls who are going to be at a higher risk for victimization because of their just life circumstances. Because, you know, we hear a lot about these incredible gymnasts who are just, you know, the stars of America, who the worst thing happened to. And it's horrific happening to any person. But we don't always hear about, you know, the immigrant child from Honduras on the street in Houston, Texas, who was not an Olympic champion, who had the same thing done to her thousands of times. And I think that is the travesty and something that I don't know how to fix.
And they're even sometimes not safe with their own parents. So we're telling people they're not safe without you. And now you have to look and say, well, is that child safe with their own parent too? The familial part of this. So
yeah.
Wow.
And even looking at institutions, we've identified that camps, at least across the country, don't necessarily have the safeguards in place. A Larry Nassar can very easily be hired by a local camp to watch over your child while they're sleeping there at summertime. Universities, we've looked at Uber and Lyft or ride sharing. Let's not name anybody specifically, but ride sharing organizations. We've questioned the background, the level of background checks that those companies have gone through. There's many different institutions that you would assume are super ironclad. They've done everything they can to ensure the safety of the user or the child. And we're identifying that that's not necessarily the case. And I think that's important for parents to be aware of.
Isn't it, you know, when we did FOSTA SESTA, you know, we were holding web platforms that were knowingly facilitating and making sure that even if they were unknowingly facilitating, they wouldn't find out if they were facilitating, to accountable, right, civilly and criminally. Michelle, I'm interested to know if you think that's what we should do in other situations, not just web platforms, but individuals. You know, I think that's what Rennie was advocating for, is the camps. That, you know, if you start hitting them in the pocket and calling them out publicly for either companies or individuals that are not taking care of these children and advocating for them, and that are knowingly facilitating or just unknowingly facilitating but not investigating enough to know if they're facilitating,
right,
that we should hold them accountable.
Yeah, no, I think it's a huge piece. And what, you know, when I sit down with families and parents and their daughters, and they're like, where can we get justice? And I really do believe, and I know it's what I do, so I'm a believer in it, but that the civil justice system, I always tell my survivors that I represent, that is your case. The criminal system is prosecuted by the state of Texas or the U.S. government if it's federal. You are a witness in that case. But in the civil case, you are the plaintiff and we steer it, and it's your case. And it is really the only place where we can not just hold the perpetrator accountable and responsible, but also a larger institution or organization in a way that actually impacts change. Because, money does impact change. Having to pay or the risk of higher insurance, all of those things impact institutional decisions. And we have seen that in church. We have seen that in sports. We need to see it more with camps and rideshare. But when these groups, companies, institutions don't do that and it costs them, they have to rethink how they're going to handle that in the future. And I believe in that wholeheartedly. I have seen it impact on a policy level where you think policy doesn't matter, but policy is what creates background checks and what creates the common sense things that helps try to prevent the Larry Nassars from ever being in that position. And so what makes institutions set policies that help us keep Larry Nassar from being alone in a room with a 10-year-old with no other adult is lawsuits. That is what has changed that. And the voices of survivors, really, who are brave enough to step forward and file those, because it's not us. It's not brave for me. It's brave for each one of them. I'm just doing my job. They're doing the hard thing.
Michelle and Jen, you guys are unbelievable. We're so proud to have you as podcast contributors. Thankful for your time on The Balanced Voice. We're going to have to wrap up there, but we know we're going to have you back because, Michelle, there were other issues we wanted to specifically talk to you about that we didn't get to today. But we thank you guys for your work in Houston and Dallas, across the state of Texas and across this country. And we look forward to more conversations. Guys, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having us. Thank you, Jennifer,
Michelle,
for what you do.
Ditto.
Bye, everybody. We'll catch you next time. Take care. If you missed anything from the show, check out the show notes at thebalancedvoicepodcast.com.
This episode was edited and mixed by the team at Real News PR. Our executive producer is Sydney Zeicher. Our advising producer is Katie Meyer. Our media and quality assurance director is Tanya Cruz. And finally, our creative design director is Elizabeth McChesney. To find out more information about Crime Stoppers of Houston or to get involved with our prevention programming, please visit us at crime-stoppers.org. You can find us on Instagram at The Balanced Voice Podcast, and you can find me online at The Runyon Report.